Whew. I don't know. Man. That song brings chills to me every time I hear it. If you don't know the story of that song, you should go look it up. It's by Horatio Spafford. And Horatio Spafford, the It Is Well With My Soul, the hymn part of that, he lost his whole family, his whole fortune. He lost everything he had in a fire, the Chicago fire, the Great Fire. And he was in the middle of the ocean where his family sank when he wrote those words. And man, it makes me a little emotional. So you're gonna have to give me a second. You know, last time I spoke, I said I was the reliever. They called in the reliever. I'm a righty, I guess. They called in the reliever. Today is not like that, okay? The reliever gets to prepare. Today, you know, if you're ever watching an NFL game and you see the quarterback get knocked out, you turn it off, okay? You know why you turn it off? Because they're bringing in the backup. The backup's been eating gummy bears in the back, right? You know, he's like, oh, me? Yeah, you got to earn your paycheck today. And so I found out as I was eating pancakes and drinking coffee with my girls this morning that Les had gotten sick, and very sick. And so, I mean, he's healthy. Let me say that again. He's not very sick, but he's sick enough not to be here. We have to be careful with Les. So everybody starts getting real nervous, okay? So, you know, Trent called me and he was like, you know, you got anything? And I was like, I know how to run chin offense, because basketball season started. Okay. But then he said, well, we have my dad's sermon, and, you know, wearing someone else's sermon's like wearing someone else's underwear. It's just weird. And so, if at some point you want to cut me off, just start waving. I'll just, you know, I love this time of year. You know, the weather starts to get a little cooler and the smell in the air gets real familiar. And of course, you start to hear the sounds of squeaking of shoes, right? On the gym floor, of course. It's basketball season, guys. It's basketball season. All right, we started practice, okay? We got our first scrimmage tomorrow. We had freshman tryouts last night. The Celtics are 5-0, just stomping everybody. So it's a good time of year. Yeah, Ty. Yeah, Nuggets or not. Okay, I got all the power up here today. We're going to jump through the story of Peter. And we're going to start at the beginning and end at the end. So y'all, you know, just buckle in because, you know, I came up here with the whole tablet. I've been waiting. No, I'm just joking. But I want to look through the story of Peter and see what we can glean just by kind of glancing over his story and then getting to the end and seeing what happened at the end of the Gospels. Not the end of his story, but the end of his story with Jesus, right? And where we first find Peter is in Matthew 4:18 through 20. Now, there's not going to be anything up here on the slides because I got called in real late. And if my phone dies, we might just cut out early because that's my Bible. Let's see, Matthew 14. And you're going to have to hold with me as I scroll through some. And it says this: one day Jesus was walking along the Sea of Galilee when he saw Simon, also called Peter, and Andrew throwing their nets into the water. They were, of course, fishermen. Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And immediately Peter and Andrew left their fishing nets and followed Jesus. It's really interesting. In another part of that story, I didn't want to read it, it's a little longer in Luke. What actually happens is Jesus sees them fishing, and they're fishing the way I fish. They're out there and they're fishing. They're catching nothing, right? That's how I fish. Anybody wants to teach me how to fish, you can, right? And Jesus says, throw your nets on the other side. And they throw their nets on the other side, and it almost capsizes their boat, right? It just all of a sudden fills with fish. And Peter, just overcome by the fact that Jesus had done this, runs to Jesus and he falls to his knees and he says, I am a sinful man. You need to get away from me. And then Jesus looks at him and he says, come, follow me. I will make you fishers of men. See, it is not in Peter's accomplishments that he is called. It is in his willingness to follow, right? Man, that's a powerful statement at the beginning of Peter's life. It is not in his accomplishments that he is called. It's in his willingness to follow. You know, if Peter had been one of the brightest of the day, if he would have been one of the best religious students of the day, if he would have been one of the leaders of the religious elite of the day, he would have been in the priesthood. He would have been one of the Pharisees. He would have been following after a rabbi, right? He would have been what they called in the dust. I think I talked about that last time, in the dust of the rabbi, just following behind him. But that's not what happens here. Peter's just a fisherman. He's just a normal dude. He didn't make all the A's on the test. He didn't get accepted in the university. He's just a guy trying to make a living. And that's the guy that Jesus comes to. I'm getting a lot of feedback. That's the guy that Jesus comes to. And he comes to him not because of what he had done, but because he is willing to go. I had to make freshman cuts. We basketball, it's weird. It's one of the only sports I think that we really have to cut because of the number of students. I've talked about that a little bit. I had 30 freshmen try out yesterday. We only have 15 uniforms. So I have to make some hard decisions. I have to have some hard conversations with kids. Every kid thinks they're going to the NBA. I don't know why. It's not easy to go to the NBA, but they just think that that's where I'm going. You know, I haven't made the team in a couple of years, but I'm going to go to the NBA. One year I had this player, and so it's pretty tough. Then the other thing that's tough is when you have a freshman team, we want to be competitive. And so my kids have to understand how to sacrifice, and part of that sacrifice might be playing time. And that's really hard for like a 15-year-old kid to understand, 14-year-old kid to understand is, hey, you're going to be on the team and you're going to practice just as hard as everybody else, but you're not going to play as much. Or you might not get to play at all sometimes. And so when you start saying in a basketball game, playing 15 kids is really hard unless you're either really good or really bad, right? Because if the game's close, you're 13, 14, 15, maybe you're 12, 13, 14, 15 don't get in the game very much. And so you have to choose the right people for those situations. You have to choose people who are willing for those situations, right? And I'll never forget a few years ago, it's probably been 6, 7 years ago, I had this player, and he just had the right heart, had the right character, worked his tail off, was a pretty good athlete, was a good football player, and he tried out his freshman year, and he made it. And I've never had a kid do this. He walked up to me and he said, "Coach," he said, "why did I make the team?" He pulled me aside. He said, "There were a lot of guys better than me." And I said his name. I'm not going to say his name. Some of y'all might know him. And I said, "Are you going to be at practice every day?" He said, "Well, yeah, Coach." I said, "Am I ever going to have to worry about your grades or you getting in trouble?" He said, "No, Coach." I said, "If you don't play, are you going to complain? Or are you going to be a problem on the team?" He said, "No, Coach." I said, "Your character is the reason you made the team." And he just kind of looked at me. I said, "Now go enjoy it," right? That's what I see in this moment. That's what I see in this moment with Peter. Jesus sees the potential of Peter. Well, first thing I want to say today is right now, Jesus is inviting you to his table. This our theme is at the table. And he is inviting you to his table, but it's not because of your ability. It is because of his grace, right? As we continue through Peter's journey, Peter has all these highs and lows, right? Peter gets to experience some of the best miracles of Christ. There are times in which Peter, James, and John are pulled away, and it's only them three that see some of the miracles that take place, right? When they go pray, it's Peter, James, and John that go pray. Peter's in the inner circle, right? And then there's times in which Peter just absolutely blows it out of the water. Peter goes, "Hey," Jesus says, "Who am I?" He goes, "You're the Messiah." And Jesus goes, "Man, you're going to be Simon. I'm sorry, you're going to be Peter. You're going to be the rock. You're not Simon anymore," right? He gives him a new name. And in the same breath, Jesus says, "Hey, I'm going to die. And this is how this is going to happen." And Peter thought the Messiah was going to come and start swinging a hammer and just knocking people out. And Peter takes him to the side, same breath, and starts rebuking Jesus. Wow, right? And Jesus turns to him after telling him he got it right, turns to him and says, "Get behind me, Satan." Right? Highs and lows of Peter's life. And then we know as we get to the end, he sits at the table and he tells Jesus, "I would never deny you." And Jesus says, No, it's going to happen 3 times. Right? And so we find that in Luke 22, 55 through 62. And you have to wait while I scroll through my Bible. Don't have anything printed out. Right? Got it. And it says this, he watched, Peter watched from the shadows as those who seized Jesus made a fire in the center of the courtyard and sat down around it. Then Peter slipped in quietly to the fire, around the fire, and he sat with them. But a young servant girl saw his face in the firelight. So he's sitting around this fire, and there's, it's campfire. And the girl sees him, and she stared at him for a while, and then she spoke. She said, "This fellow here was with Jesus. I recognize him." And Peter says, "Woman, I don't even know the man." Now, a little bit later, a man also recognized him. He's, I recognize you. You're one of Jesus' followers. He says, "Man, you're wrong. I'm not." An hour or so passed, and he's still sitting around that fire. And another person pointed to Peter. He said, "This fellow is obviously a Galilean." He's saying he looks like a guy from Galilee. He must be a member of Jesus' group. And Peter says, "Look, I have no idea what you're talking about." And he hadn't even finished the sentence when a nearby rooster crowed. The Lord turned toward Peter, and their eyes met. Peter remembered Jesus' words about his triple denial before the rooster would crow, and he left the courtyard, and he wept bitterly. I think one of the hardest lessons for students to learn and adults to overcome is just the simple truth that we will fail at times. That we will fail. I teach computer science, and I'm not going to get into all of what that is, but computer science is a pretty difficult subject. What the hardest thing, when I teach it, I've taught the valedictorian and salutatorian at West High School for the last 5 years. That's not because I like something, it's because they've taken my class and I've gotten to learn from these kids who are going to change the world, right? And what I've recognized is I've taught these kids that are like the top 10% kids, is they come into my class, and part of computer science is you're writing code, and if you just happen to mistype one thing, it just won't work. And it gets so frustrating. And what I've noticed is that we've trained our kids at times to not be willing to fail. They don't understand failure. And so in our school, they've been taught you got to make the 100, especially these top 10 kids. They're fighting for GPA, all this stuff, right? Trying to get scholarships. You got to get it right every time the first time, every time the first time, every time the first time. And what I've learned is that they don't know how to fail. So the first thing I do in my class is I stop and I go, "Hey guys, y'all are going to fail this class." They look at me. I said, "You're going to fail over and over and over again. But what this class is going to teach you is not to stop when you fail." I said, "This isn't about your grade. I don't really care about grades." I tell kids that all the time, like grades or whatever. It is about you learning to be able to process what happens when everything goes wrong. Because things are going to go wrong. And we set our kids up at times. This is one of my struggles. I think at times we set our kids up and we want to create a pillow underneath them and not let them ever hit the ground and deal with the pain of failure. But what happens is when they get out, they don't know how to deal with the pain of failure. And the truth is, in life, you are going to fail, right? I struggle with this. I talk to someone regularly. It's just kind of part of what I think is something that's healthy for me. And I'm just kind of open and honest about that. And my counselor I talk to regularly started recognizing some things about perfectionism. I tend to be a very perfectionistic person. I will sit and look at something and just struggle over it for days, right? Probably the best way for me to prepare for a sermon is to get a call an hour before. Right? Because if I get a call an hour before, I'm not going to freak out on it. I didn't have to freak out on my wife, right? I didn't have to have all the high anxiety. If it fails, it fails. I have an excuse, right? But what my counselor started seeing is you have this thing that you think that everything has to be perfect. And then she asked me this really riveting question. She said, "Cody, what does perfection look like for you? Describe it." She tried to make me put feet to it, right? Do you get what I'm saying? Like, what would it actually look like if you were perfect? What would your life look like? I just kind of stared at her. I have no idea. I said, "It's not about a state championship. I didn't come to Victoria West to win state championships. You got to go to Dallas usually to do that. Like, I would love to. I'd love to compete for one, and we might. I'm not saying we won't, but that's just." I coach basketball because I want to help young boys turn to young men, right? I want to compete. I'm about competing. I want to go win championships. But, in my family, I don't know. I guess that I would be a good dad. Because are you a good dad? I guess. And it really hit me that I think that at times we just don't know how to deal with failure. That's why I love coaching. See, in coaching, there's going to be failure. There's going to be failure every game. The way I talk about basketball is a game of mistakes. Coach Reeves, I bet you talk about football the same way. Mistakes happen. I watched your team this week handle every mistake. It's hard to sit on the other side. It is, but I watched your team and watch what you're doing there. We're lucky in Victoria to have you influencing young men and young women. And the thing about coaching is that it's going to happen. And what's the hardest thing is to teach young men who've invested every bit of time in their life, hundreds of hours of their life, to succeed at a sport, and teaching them how to handle it when they fail, when they lose. When you walk into a locker room and you have to talk about, during the season, it's okay, what are we going to do from here? But then at some point, you play your last game. And you got to walk in the locker room and you got to talk about failure. And you got to teach kids at that point how to handle it. And I'm not always sure how to handle it, as you can see above. Okay. It angers me when people leave games before they're done. I mean, just absolutely, guys, if you're going to a football game and you're leaving before the game's done, unless your kids are crying or someone's sick, if you're leaving because the team's losing and you don't wait for the school song, it just angers me. Because what are we teaching our team? What are we teaching our kids? What are we telling them? Is their value only in their success? See, as our society, we've lost some of our ability to appropriately handle failure. And it's exactly what happens to Peter here. He fails and he runs. That's what it says. Rooster crows, he fails, he meets eyes with Jesus. I can't even imagine that moment. And he runs. He runs from his failure. But the story doesn't end. John 21. Trent, am I doing okay on time? He's not up here yet. Sometimes Trent gets up here, he's playing on that thing. I'm like, oh man, I'm on 0.1 and there's 0.5. So we're going to wrap this thing up. You ever see that fear on face? That's what it is. John 21, 1 through 19. We don't have this. I would encourage you to go read this verse, these scriptures. This is a story at the end of John. And it starts, and Peter says this. He says, everything's happened. Jesus has died. He's resurrected. He's come back. They've seen him. This is going to be the third time is what it says, that they've seen him. And Peter is still dealing with the midst of his failure. Remember where Peter started. Peter was a fisherman, right? Jesus comes and he says, come be my student. Let me be your rabbi. Let me be your teacher, and you walk in my dust. And he started to transform Peter's life. But we find in John 21, verse 3, Peter says this, I'm going fishing. The disciples say, then we will come with you. Got to be careful when you're a leader. Leadership's not something you can turn on and off. Right? What does Peter do? Peter says, I'm going back to my old life. This has failed. I have failed. This has failed. I'm going back. Have you done that before? I've felt that before, right? I'm going back to my old life. I'm going to go and I'm going to fish. And like I said, you have to be real careful when you're a leader, because if you're a leader of an organization or you're a leader of a team, you're going to lead people one way or another no matter what. And the disciples look at Peter and he's the leader and they say, you know what? We'll go back to our old lives too. They went out in the boat and they caught nothing through the night. Once again, my experience, right? It's this great story, just out there fishing. I'm going to go back and do what I used to be able to do. And it's like Jesus is like, no, that's not going to work. Okay, and as day was breaking, Jesus was standing on the beach, but they did not know it was Jesus. And Jesus says this, my sons, you haven't caught any fish, have you? The disciples say no. He says, throw your net to the starboard side of the boat, and your net will find fish. And they did what he said, and suddenly they could not lift their nets because of the massive weight of the fish that filled it. Do y'all see how it's telling the same story? The Bible is told so beautifully. We sometimes miss out on the fact that it's also a beautiful piece of literature. They're reflecting back on what had happened. It's the same exact story. Throw your nets to the other side. The nets are full and bringing the boat over. And this is written in John, right? And John is the guy who writes it. And I love John because he says this, the disciple loved by Jesus. If you're wondering who the disciple loved by Jesus is, it's John. Okay, he calls himself in his own autobiography, the disciple Jesus loved, right? That's great. That's just classic. He says the disciple loved by Jesus turned to Peter and said, "It is the Lord." And immediately when Simon Peter heard these words, he threw on his shirt, which he had taken off to do his work, and dove into the sea. And the rest of the disciples followed him, bringing in the boat and dragging their nets full of fish. And they were close to the shore, fishing only about 100 yards off. And when they arrived on the shore, they saw a charcoal fire laid with fish on the grill, and he had bread too. Peter, who's been living in shame, sees it is the Lord. When John says that, something clicks in Peter. And instead of running from the situation, Peter runs towards the situation. Y'all see that? I can just see it. I can see the picture in my mind of him just throwing on his clothes and diving in the water and just floundering as fast as he can and running to Jesus, because all he wants to do is say, I need you. I want you. I want this to be fixed. And when he gets there, Jesus says, bring some of the fish you just caught. Jesus already had fish on the grill. It's kind of interesting. He'd already caught his own fish, right? He's has some fish on the grill. He says, bring some of the fish that you've caught. He says, come and join me for breakfast. And none of the disciples dared to ask who he was, because they knew it was the Lord. In the midst of our failures, sometimes we tend to run. And what we find is Jesus is always still sitting on the shore. Come back. Come back. Come back to the table. Come sit with me. See, the shame that comes with our failures is a shame that Jesus takes away. You get what I'm saying? And at the point where we realize when we run towards him in the midst of those failures, that we embrace the fact that we're not going to have perfectionism, is the point where we get to sit at the table and eat. That's what he wants. Be honest, a year ago from today, I was thinking about this as I was writing this sermon an hour ago. A year ago from today, around this time, I'd lost perspective. I've said this before. Lost perspective on what I was doing coaching, lost perspective. Just in my heart, everything was wrong. I'd hurt my family. I knew I had hurt my family. And I got to this point where in April, my grandmother had passed away. And I knew that I was in the wrong in a lot of things. That's what I'll say. I just knew that I was in the wrong. But I had no idea how to deal with it. In my perfectionism and my thoughts about failure, I just sat and I just thought about my failure. And as Les and I prepared for my grandmother's funeral, as I watched the last few days of my grandmother's life, and I watched, instead of sorrow, I watched joy. Instead of fear, I watched embrace. Because my grandmother was a godly woman who lived a life where she'd affected a lot of people. God just sat on the shore. He said, come here. Come here. Come back. I thought, man, you don't need me back. Like, look at me. Come here. Come back. You jump in the water, you swim towards, you don't know what to find. And what Peter finds, to me, is one of the most beautiful stories in Scripture. They were sitting around a charcoal fire, right? Do you remember the story I told from the denial? Where did he sit? Amongst a fire. I don't think it's chance that that's written there. My grandfather passed away when Maddie was young, and he was the second of my grandfathers to lose. Both my grandfathers were very, very important men in my life, and I was given some of his shirts, some of his polos. They're old man polos, and I you know what I'm talking about. And I would wear them just because they were his. And I remember the first time I put one on, smelled. All I could smell was him. This made me cry, brought all these feelings back. He was one of the funniest men I knew, made me smile. For years, I didn't wash those shirts because I just wanted to smell my grandfather. Because smell has a really particular part of your memory. And I see Peter come back and he sits amongst the charcoal fire and he thinks about the fire he sat by before. And before he was asked 3 questions, right? Jesus grabs Peter and he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these other things? He pulls him away. Do you love me more than these other? Do you love me more than fishing? Do you love me more than everything else in your life? And Simon looks at him and he says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus says, take care of my lambs. And Jesus asked him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Simon Peter says, yes, Lord, you must surely know that I love you. And he says, shepherd my sheep. And for the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was devastated. It says he was hurt because he asked him the question the third time. And Simon said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. He says, look after my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you would dress yourself and go where you pleased. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and take you to a place you do not want to go. And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. See, Peter was eventually crucified. And what Jesus is doing in this moment is he's bringing him back to that fire and he's taking him back and he's asking those 3 questions to make up for the 3 denials. Do y'all see that? It's not Jesus who needs it made up for. It's Peter. Peter needs to be reset. It's like holding the button, holding the 2 buttons on the iPhone and resetting it, right? He needs to be reset. And Jesus finishes by follow me. Same words he started the conversation with, he ends them. In life, Jesus not only calls us to the table in the midst of our failure, but he transforms your failure into purpose. Fear is converted to vision, and failure is transformed to purpose. Shame is converted to vision, and failure is transformed to purpose. When Jesus was on that side and he was calling me in last year, and I said, okay, and I went and talked to Les, and Les said, hey, we're needing something with students. And I said, I have no idea how I'm going to have time to do something with students, but Jesus is definitely calling something on me right now. See, failure is turned to purpose. My challenge to you today is just to ask yourself that question. Is there something you're stuck on right now? Just realize God's inviting you to his table. He's still sitting on the shore. Come, follow me. I'll bring you back to where you failed. I'll transform that, and I will make you new. I challenge you to do something outside of that. Ask yourself that question. Am I in? Am I the one swimming towards the side of the shore? Am I doing that continually? But the next thing I would say is this. Are you inviting someone around to your table to share the same thing? See, when Jesus brings them to the fire, he brings them to eat breakfast. He brings them to his table. There's something really special about the table. There's something really special about sharing a meal with yourself. In Jewish custom, it was a very special thing. It's a very important thing. But to me, as I've been around, when we share meals with people, suddenly it breaks down walls. When you're willing to invite someone into your house and set them at your table and cook for them and eat with them, it breaks down the walls that are around. I'm going to challenge you as we have this at the table this month. I'm going to challenge you to do this. Invite someone from this church that you don't know well to your table. Find out their story. Maybe it's a little like Peter's. The second thing is invite someone whose relationship with you needs to be healed. Just like Jesus was healing Peter's relationship. Invite them to your table. Cook for them. Sit and eat. And see what God can do with that. Lord, I just thank you for this day. I thank you for the blessing of a church who loves and cares for you. And God, I just ask that as we continue on through this week, that we're able to see the moments where our failures become our concentration instead of your grace becoming our focus. And I pray that you break down the walls that we've built to hide in our lives. I love you, and I pray these things in your name. Amen.